Changing personal history and organization. Yesterday we described a number of ways that you can get rapport with another person and join their model of the world, as a prelude to helping them find new choices in behavior. Those are all examples of what we call pacing or mirroring. To the extent that you can match another person's behavior, both verbally and non-verbally, you will be pacing their experience. Mirroring is the essence of what most people call rapport, and there are as many dimensions to it as your sensory experience can discriminate. You can mirror the other person's predicates and syntax, body posture, breathing, voice tone and tempo, facial expression, eye blinks, etc. There are two kinds of nonverbal pacing. One is direct mirroring. An example is when I breathe at the same rate and depth that you breathe. Even though you're not conscious of that, it will have a profound impact upon you. Another way to do nonverbal pacing is to substitute one nonverbal channel for another. We call that crossover mirroring. There are two kinds of crossover mirroring. One is to cross over in the same channel. I can use my hand movement to pace your breathing movement, the rise and fall of your chest. Even though the movement of my hand is very subtle, it still has the same effect. It's not as dramatic as direct mirroring, but it's very powerful. That is using a different aspect of the same channel, kinesthetic movement. In the other kind of crossover mirroring, you switch channels. For example, as I speak to you, I watch your breathing, and I gauge the tempo of my voice to the rise and the fall of your chest. That's a different kind of crossover. I match the tempo of my speech to the rate of your breathing. Once you have paced well, you can lead the other person into new behavior by changing what you are doing. The overlap pattern we mentioned yesterday is an example of that. You join the client in their representation of the world and then overlap into a different representation. Pacing and leading is a pattern that is evident in almost everything we do. If it is done gracefully and smoothly, it will work with anyone, including catatonics. Once I was in Napa State Mental Hospital in California, and a guy had been sitting there for several years on the couch in the dayroom. The only communication he was offering me were his body position and his breathing rate. His eyes were open, pupils dilated. So I sat facing away from him at about a 45-degree angle in a chair nearby, and I put myself in exactly the same body position. I didn't even bother to be smooth. I put myself in the same body position, and I sat there for 40 minutes breathing with him. At the end of 40 minutes I had tried little variations in my breathing, and he would follow, so I knew I had rapport at that point. I could have changed my breathing slowly over a period of time and brought him out that way. Instead I interrupted it and shocked him. I shouted, "Hey, do you have a cigarette?" He jumped up off the couch and said, "God, don't do that. I have a friend who is a college president. He is living in a delusional reality that he's intelligent and that he has a lot of prestige and all those things. He walks around stiffly, looks gruff and smokes a pipe. He does this whole number. It's a completely delusional reality. The last time I was in a mental hospital, there was a guy there who thought he was a CIA agent, and that he was being held there by the communists. The only difference between them is that the rest of the people in the world are more apt to believe the college president than the psychotic. The college president gets paid for his delusions. In order to pace either of them, I'm going to accept their reality. With the college president, I'm going to say that, since he's so intelligent and prestigious, he will be able to, and then I'll say whatever I want him to do. If I go to an academic conference and I'm there with all the people who live in the psychotic reality of academia, I am going to pace that reality. I'll present a paper, because raw experience wouldn't pace their reality. If there was any experience there, it would just go right by them. 81 With the psychotic who believes he's a CIA agent. 111 Open the door, look back, slip in and close the door quickly, and whisper, "At last we got through to you. Phew. I almost got caught coming in here. Now, quick, I only have a few minutes to give you these instructions. Are you ready? We have gotten you a cover as a college professor, and we want you to apply for this job and wait until you hear from us. You can do that because you've been trained to do it as an agent, right? Do it well, so that you're not discovered and sent back here. Got it? When you join someone else's reality by pacing them, that gives you rapport and trust, and puts you in a position to utilize their reality in ways that change it. Nonverbal mirroring is a powerful unconscious mechanism that every human being uses to communicate effectively. You can predict by looking at people communicating with each other in a restaurant whether they are communicating well or not by observing their postures and movements. Most of the therapists I know who mirror do it compulsively. We did a seminar in which there was a woman who was an exquisitely good communicator who mirrored very compulsively. As she was talking with me, I began sliding off my chair, and she literally fell on the floor. If you believe that you have to have empathy, that means that you have to have the same feelings that your client does in order to function well as a therapist. Someone comes in and says, "Well, I have this kind of phobic response every time I walk down the street and begin to talk to somebody. I feel like I'm going to throw up, you know. I just feel real nauseous and lightheaded and I feel like I'm going to sway." If you have to mirror, you're going to get sick. How many of you have ever finished a day of doing therapy or educational work and gone home and felt like you took some of the residue home with you? You know that experience. The statistics show about 8 years shorter lifespan for people in therapy than almost any other profession. If you work with people who are diseased or dying, you don't want to mirror that directly, unless you want a very short career. People in therapy are always talking about pain, sadness, emptiness, suffering, and enduring the tribulations of human existence. If you have to understand their experience by experiencing it, then my guess is you're going to have a really unpleasant time. The important thing is to have a choice between direct mirroring or crossover mirroring. With someone who breathes normally, pace with your own breathing. With someone who is asthmatic, pace with your hand movement or something else. Now let's do something with this, and all the things we talked about yesterday. Is there someone here who has a past experience that they think about from time to time, and it makes them have a feeling that they don't want? Okay, Linda, this is secret therapy. Your task is always to keep the content of what goes on from the people here. Because if you tell them the content, they will become involved. And if they become involved, it will be harder for them to learn. Whenever we ask a person to come and make a change here as a demonstration, we will insist that they keep the content to themselves. Usually we'll say, "I want you to pick a code word, a color, a number, a letter for what you want to change." So the person will say, "I want to be able to or, I don't want to have to 3. That has a couple of positive dimensions. If the outcome we're after is to teach people how to do what we do, then we will demand that it be content-free pure process therapy. Then the only things you have available to pay attention to are the pieces of the process. You cannot hallucinate effectively on number 3, at least not as effectively as you can on assertiveness, or love, or trust, or any of those other nominalizations. In addition, it has an extra advantage. If you are in any context in which people know each other, many people are reluctant to work on material which they think might change their relationship with the people who are there. By doing secret therapy you avoid that difficulty because nobody knows what they are working on. Linda, what do you recall that gives you the unpleasant feeling? Is it a set of images or a voice? Okay, she already answered the question nonverbally. If you were watching her eyes, you saw them move up to her left and then down to her right. So she makes an eidetic visual image and then has a feeling about it. Linda, when you see this image you have certain feelings which are unpleasant to you. Now I'd like you to look at the image and find out if you still get the unpleasant feeling when you look at it now. And I'd like you to do a good job of that. You can close your eyes and really take a good look at it. Pause. As she experiences the feelings, he touches her right shoulder. And as you can all see by her responses, Linda is telling the truth. When she sees that picture she feels bad. So there is some past experience that occurred, and things didn't turn out quite the way you would have liked them to. That's an understatement if I've heard right. Linda. Right. That's exactly right. So from time to time an image comes into your mind, and when you think about it, you get the same kind of feelings that you had as a result of that experience. Now, I would like you to think what resource you would have needed back then to have made a different response to that situation, a response which would have given you a much more acceptable outcome if you had made it. Wait a minute, because I want to tell you what I mean by resource. By resource I don't mean some outside help or anything like that. What I mean by a resource is more confidence, more assertiveness, more trust, more caring, any internal resource. At this point in time, some time has elapsed. I don't know how much, but during that interval you have gained resources as a human being that you didn't have access to then. I want you to select a resource that would have enabled you to have had a wholly different experience back then. I don't want you to tell me what it is. I just want you to think of what it would be. Pause. As she thinks of the resource, he touches her left shoulder. Did those of you watching notice some changes? Let's call the response she gets from the picture Y, and the new resource that she needed back there we'll call X now. Let's demonstrate. Which of those two responses is this? He touches her right shoulder. Now, you should be able to see the color changes, lip size changes, breathing changes, actual trembling in her body, that we have called Y. Now which response is this? He touches her left shoulder. Now, when I say that she needs this resource X, I have given you as much information verbally as you ever get from your clients when they tell you what they want. If a client says, I want to be more assertive, I want to be more trusting, I want to be more caring, more respectful of other people, they have given you exactly the same amount of information as saying, I need X. In a way they have given you less. Because if they say, I want to be more assertive, you're going to take your meaning of assertive and assign it to their behavior. If they say, well, what I need is some X, you won't run the risk of misunderstanding them. Sometimes I think it would be easier to do therapy in a foreign language that you didn't speak. That way you would not have the illusion that the words you heard had the same meaning for the person who utters them as they have for you. And believe me, that's an illusion. Now why does response Y occur when I touch her right shoulder? Have you noticed that occurs? Has anyone in here noticed that? What's going on here? It's really spooko time. Linda, do you believe in free will? Linda. Yeah. He touches her right shoulder. Now who tightened the muscles around your mouth? Whose free will do you believe in? Free will is a funny phrase. It's also a nominalization. When you came up here in response to my request, you made a statement about your own free will. I said, I want somebody up here who makes pictures that they don't want to make. That is a statement that someone is making those pictures and it isn't you. It's your unconscious or your mother, one or t'other. Now, what's going on? Did anybody make sense out of that? Woman. When you were asking her to go deep inside of her and see that image, you put your hand on her right shoulder as she was feeling the bad feelings, so she had an association with the touch. Do you mean to tell me that now every time I touch her on the shoulder like that, she'll have that response? He touches her right shoulder again, and response Y occurs. Man, it sure looks that way. I agree with you. How could something that powerful be overlooked by modern psychology? Here you are, adult human beings. Most of you have been to college, and most of you are professional communicators. You've learned about human beings and how human beings work. How do you make sense out of this? Does the name Pavlov ring a bell? This is straight stimulus response conditioning. Linda had a certain experience which was her response to an accessing question that I asked her, namely about this experience that she wants to change. As she fully recovered that experience, and I knew when she had fully recovered it by observing her responses, all I had to do was touch her. That touch is now associated with the entire experience that she recalled. It's the same process as the thing that she wants to change. How is it that when she makes that picture she has a set of feelings automatically? She sees a picture, bam, she has the unpleasant feeling. It's the same process. When a person is in a certain state of consciousness such as the experience Y for Linda, you can introduce a new dimension in any sensory system, such as a touch. We call this an anchor, in this case, a kinesthetic anchor. As long as I repeat that touch with the same pressure at the same point on Linda's body, and she has no stronger competing states of consciousness when I begin, it will always re-access that experience. It's straight conditioning. It constitutes, in my opinion, one of the most powerful covert tools that you can use as a therapist or as a communicator. It will get you almost everything. About 90% of what goes on in therapy is changing the kinesthetic responses that people have to auditory and visual stimuli. My husband makes me feel bad. My wife always makes me angry. Now let's demonstrate one, and this is only one way, to use it. What I'd like you to do, Linda, is to go back to this experience. Close your eyes and go back to that experience. This time I want you to take this resource with you. He touches her left shoulder, and I want you to see yourself respond in a whole new way. Go all the way through it until you're satisfied. What she's doing now is reliving it with the new resource available, which wasn't available the first time this happened, until she is satisfied with her response in that situation. We call this process changing personal history. You go back into your personal history with resources you did not have then, taking them with you this time. We don't know what the content of this is, and there's no need for us to. She is reliving the experience now. After this she will have two histories, the real one in which she didn't have the resource, and the new one in which she did have the resource. As long as these are full experiences, and we're guaranteeing that by anchoring, both will serve equally well as guides for future behavior. Linda. She opens her eyes and smiles broadly. I love it. Okay, now, Linda, I would like you to go back and make the old picture again, the one that made you feel bad, and tell me what happens. Observers, what do you see, X or Y? And this is where the sensory experience really counts. You can do the therapy, but knowing whether or not it worked is the most essential piece. Man. I see a mixture of X and Y. What happens in your experience, Linda? When you see that picture, do you feel the same way you did before? Linda. No, I do not. Don't reveal any content, just tell us how it's different. Linda. My fear is gone. Now, there's another way to check your work. Anchoring can be used in a number of ways. Now, watch this. He touches her right shoulder. Is that the same response that touch elicited before? Woman. Partially. Partially. Now, if it were to be entirely reversed, I would consider that doing the client a disservice. If you are in the business of choice, you are in the business of adding choices, not subtracting them, and not substituting one rigid stimulus response circuit for another. If you have a client who feels helpless and small each time he goes to work, and you change that so each time he goes to work he feels assertive, happy, and confident, he is no better off, in my opinion. He still has only one choice about how to respond. And if you have one choice, you're a robot. We think therapy is the business of turning robots into people. That's not an easy task. We all get robotized. Part of your job is to change that situation unconsciously, so that people actually exercise choice in their behavior, whether it's conscious or not. What is choice? Choice, to me, is having multiple responses to the same stimulus. Do you realize that each time you read a book there are probably no new words in that book? It's the same old words in a new order? Just new sequences of the same words? No matter where you go, you're going to hear the same old words, or just new sequences of the same old words. And each time I read a fiction book, it's the same thing. Practically every word we've used today has been an old word. How can you learn anything new? Now, we need to do one more thing that's very important. Linda has the choice sitting here in this room. You've all seen that. We want her to also have this choice in other contexts. All of you have had the following experience. You work with a client and you and the client both know that they have new choices. They leave the office and you're happy and they're happy and congruent, and 2 weeks later when they come back they go, well, it didn't quite. I don't know what happened. I knew it, and Or worse yet, they come back and present you with the exact same problem, with very little memory that you even worked on it 2 weeks ago. Linda was in an altered state up here. She radically altered her consciousness to go after old experiences, to integrate them with new kinds of resources. The point is, and this was a primary insight of family therapy 20 years ago, if you simply induce changes in an altered state of consciousness known as an institution, or a therapist's office, or a group setting, it's very unlikely that most of your work will transfer the first time. You'll have to do it several times. You have to be sure that the new understandings and learnings, the new behavior, the new choices, transfer out of that altered state of consciousness into the appropriate context in the real world. There's a very easy process that we call bridging or future pacing that connects the new response with the appropriate context. It's another use of anchoring. You know what the new response is, and you know that the person wants it to occur in some context, so you simply ask them the following question: what is the first thing that you would see, hear, or feel that would allow you to know you are in the context where you want to make this new choice? Linda, there are other situations in your present life that are similar to the one that you saw in those pictures, right? Situations in which you respond the same way you responded to that picture, instead of the way you would like to respond. Now, what I need to know is what allows you to know that a context is similar to that one. Is it something about what you see? Is it the tone of someone's voice, the way someone sounds, the way someone is touching you? Linda, it's the way someone looks. Okay, I want you to see what that looks like. And as you see that, each time you see anything similar, you will feel this. He touches the resource anchor. I want you to remember that you have this particular resource. That's bridging. It takes a minute and a half or 2 minutes, and it guarantees that your work will transfer out into the real world. The same stimulus that in the past elicited the maladaptive stereotyped behavior, the feeling that she wants to change, now serves as a stimulus for which the resource is a response. Now she will automatically have access to the new choice in the contexts where she needs it, not just in the office, the group, the institution. This is stimulus-stimulus conditioning. You're not going to be there to squeeze her shoulder, so you need to make some part of the actual context the trigger for her new behavior. The best thing to use as the trigger is whatever was the trigger for the unwanted behavior. If her boss's tone of voice makes her feel helpless, then make that tone of VOICE the trigger to access the resources of creativity, confidence, or whatever. Otherwise, if the old anchors that exist are stronger than the new ones that you've created, the old ones will override the new ones. That is what prompted the development of family therapy. They take a schizophrenic kid and they put him in a hospital and they give him M&Ms in the right order and the kid gets better and he's well and normal, happy, learning. Then they put him back in the family and he's schizophrenic again in a matter of weeks. And so they said, something in the family keeps the kid the same, so therefore we will treat the whole family. You don't have to treat the whole family. That's one way to do it. It's a choice. If you bring the family in, the anchors are there, and you can use them. In fact, 111 demonstrate. You can sit down now, Linda. Thank you. I'd like 2 people to come up here and role-play a husband and wife. Thank you. Larry and Susie. Now as a wife, would you give me some complaints? What does he do or not do? Susie. He drinks too much beer. Hell, never watch football with me. Hell, never watch football with you? And how does that make you feel? Susie. Mad. Deserted. Deserted, so what you want is some attention from him. Susie. Right. And when you try to get attention from him, what? Look at that, he went right up into a visual access. Boom. That's what typically happens. The wife says, I feel I want him to touch me, and the husband goes, looking up, well, I don't see how that's useful. Right? And then he comes into the house and says, look, this place is a mess. I can't stand to see a cluttered house. And she says, but it feels cozy this way. Now what I'm going to do here is use anchoring. I say, well, I find that hard to believe, but let me check it out. So I come over here and ask the husband a few rhetorical questions, simply for the purpose of eliciting responses. I say, Larry, let me ask you a question. Are there some times when you feel like you really want to be close to her, give her some attention and some good feelings and really get close to her? Are there times like that? Larry. Sure, there are times. He touches Larry's wrist. Now, I know, based on my past experience as a therapist, that couples usually get in trouble with words, because people are not very good with words. They don't train adults to use words, they don't even train children. So what I'm going to recommend to you, Susie, is that you try the following. I'm going to give you a nonverbal signal to try with Larry for the next 2 weeks just as a way to find out whether or not he really is open to paying attention to you. What I would like you to do is this. Anytime you want 5 or 10 minutes of his undivided attention and some affection, walk up to him and hold him on the wrist like this. Okay, and would you do that right now? I want to check and make sure you know what I mean. Now, Susie, when you do this, look at him and he will nod or shake his head depending upon whether or not he feels this is an appropriate time to spend some time with you. This way he gets a message from you which is unambiguous, because if you come up to him and say, harsh voice, punching his arm, want to watch football? He might misinterpret that. I can send this couple off and let them try it. I'll tell her, now, you're only to use this twice a day. Of course she'll be curious and she will try it. And what's underneath the nonverbal signal? An anchor. So what will happen? Will he nod, yes, or shake his head, no? Now, the first few times when she does this, she'll complete the whole pattern. But pretty soon it will streamline. She'll walk in and just start to reach for him and that will be enough. Pretty soon she'll be able to walk in and just look at him and that will elicit the same response. Couples get into trouble because they don't know how to elicit responses from one another. The response they intend to get is completely different from the one they actually get. For instance, say I have a guy here who really wants her to come and comfort him sometimes. So he sits on the end of the bed and stares at the floor. She, of course, assumes that this means that he wants space for himself, so what does she do? She leaves the room. They end up in therapy 17 years later and he says to me, she doesn't support me when I need support. And she says, do, too. He says, you've never done it in 17 years when I really needed it. I say, how do you let her know you need it? He says, well, when I sit on the end of the bed, I show her. And she says, oh, I thought you wanted to be alone. That's why we say, the response that you get is the meaning of your communication. This is a way that you can get the responses that people want connected with their own behavior. Now when Susie here wants affection, she has a direct way of eliciting that part of him. After you give a few anchors, they begin to do it on their own without ever knowing what happened. They suddenly start getting what they want, mysteriously. That's one way of using anchoring with couples. Most couples have simply habituated to each other's behavior, and they cease to do anything new with each other. It's not that they are not capable of it, it's that they are so anchored into rigid patterns of interacting that they don't do anything new. Very rarely do I find any serious dysfunction between couples other than having habituated into rigid patterns. Whenever there are rigid and repetitive patterns or responses that you want to interrupt, you can begin by anchoring something unpleasant or attention-getting, and fire that anchor whenever the pattern or response occurs. With a couple I saw once, his whole experience in life was making constructed images of possibilities, and her function in life was responding to anything he said by making an eidetic image of something that was similar and talking about how it didn't work. So he would go, I want to make a skylight in the bedroom, and she would say, we were over at so-and-so's house and their skylight leaked. They never had any other kind of communication. There was nothing else. I did therapy with these two in my living room. When I came in, I sat down and said, you know, I'm kind of a city kid and living out here in the country I've had some real surprises. Did you know that a rattlesnake came right through my living room, right here, yesterday? Right across the floor. It was the damnedest thing. As I said that, I looked down at the floor just behind their chairs and slowly followed an imaginary snake with my eyes as it went across the floor. Then the couple began to speak. Whenever they would start to argue, I would look down at the floor again and they would stop. I began to anchor their terror of snakes to having that conversation. After about an hour of doing that, they didn't have that conversation anymore. It was too unpleasant, because after a while their feelings about snakes became associated with arguing. If you're going to talk to somebody and you know that there's even a possibility that you might need to interrupt them, you can set them up like that before you begin the session. You can interrupt behaviorally like that, or you can interrupt with words, oh wait a second. What? Or you can look at their ankle and say, are you allergic to bee stings? That 11 get their attention. Stop. I just thought of something I have to remember to write down. Anchoring is an amazing thing. You can anchor air and people will respond to it. Any good mime anchors air by his movements, defining objects and concepts in empty space. Recently I was teaching a sales course and somebody said, you always tell us to be flexible. What happens if you try a whole bunch of stuff, and someone responds to you really negatively? I said, well, the first thing to do is move, and then point to where you were, and talk about how terrible that is. That's called dissociation. You can go in and try the hard sell. When you see that they are responding negatively, you can step aside and say, now, that kind of talk puts people off, and try something else. Those of you who are interested in really becoming more generative, when you get tired of touching people's knees and forearms, understand that anchoring is one of the most universal and generalizable of all the things that we have ever done. Once I was lecturing to 250 fairly austere psychologists, being academic, talking about representational systems and books, and drawing equations. In the middle of my academic lecture I just walked up to the edge of the stage, looked up for a moment, and said, that's weird, and then continued. A little later I looked up and did it again. Well, that's really weird. I did that a couple more times during my talk, and most of the people in the first 4 or 5 rows became fixated, staring at this spot on the ceiling. Then I moved over to the side, and talked right through to them. I could get arm levitation and other unconscious responses. If people would notice that what they are doing is not working and do something new, then being in a couple would be a really interesting experience. Actually, they need to do something even before that. They need to realize what outcome they want, and then notice whether or not they are getting it. One thing that we have done with couples is to take away their ability to talk to each other. You can't talk to each other anymore until I tell you to. If I catch you talking to each other, I'll give you warts. They have to generate new behavior, and they begin to become interesting to each other, if nothing else. Even if they keep the same patterns of behavior, at least they generate some new content. They have to learn new ways to elicit the responses that they want. He wants her to iron a shirt for him, so he comes in and walks up to her and gestures with his hands. So she goes out and gets a piece of bread and butters it for him and brings it back in, right? Now, in the past, when he'd say, "Will you iron my shirt?" and she did something else, he would criticize her. "You never do what I want," and so on. Now when he gets the piece of bread, he can't criticize because he can't talk. In order for him to get what he wants, he's got to change his own behavior. So he tries again. He hands her the shirt, and she puts it on. He's got to keep coming up with new behaviors until he finds one that works. Then I can use that as an example. I can say, "Look, even if you do it with words, if what you do doesn't work, try altering your own behavior." As they learn to vary their behavior, they will be establishing new anchors. Only about half of them will be useful, but that still gives them a lot of new possibilities in their relationship. The nice thing about family therapy is that people bring their anchors with them. If you have a child who is responding in a troublesome way, you can observe what he is responding to, because all the primary hypnotic relationships are there. When children have symptomatic behavior, their symptomatic behavior is always a response to something. Anyone's symptomatic behavior is a response to something, and the question is, what? If you can change what they are responding to, it's often much easier than changing their behavior. You don't always have to know what it is, but it's often very easy to tell. You have a hyperactive kid with his parents, and for the first 5 minutes of the session he's not hyperactive. Then the father looks at the mother and says, "What are you going to do about this kid?" When the kid immediately starts jumping around, it gives you a mild indication of what he's responding to. But you won't notice that if you're inside making pictures and talking to yourself about which drugs you are going to give him. Man. What if you have a suicidal kid? How do you look for the stimulus for that? Always depressed, always sitting there. Well, 99 times out of 100, depression will fall into the pattern we already talked about. I wouldn't try family therapy, not until I'd taken care of the suicide part of it. I would try a question like, what resource would you need as a human being to know that you could go on living and have lots of happiness? And then do what we did with Linda, the change history pattern. Our presupposition is that any human being who comes and says, "Help. I need help," has already tried with all their conscious resources, and failed utterly. However, we also presuppose that somewhere in their personal history they have had some set of experiences which can serve as a resource for helping them get exactly what they want in this particular situation. We believe that people have the resources that they need, but they have them unconsciously, and they are not organized in the appropriate context. It's not that a guy can't be confident and assertive at work, it's that he isn't. He may be perfectly confident and assertive on the golf course. All we need to do is to take that resource and put it where he needs it. He has the resource that he needs to be confident and assertive in his business on the golf course, but he has never made that transfer, that connection. Those are dissociated parts of himself. Anchoring, and the integration that occurs with anchoring, will give you a tool to collapse dissociations, so that the person has access to the resource in the context that they need it. Man. Are there situations where that's not true and the therapist needs to give the person a, "No, I don't know of any"? I'd like to mention something that is relevant for your own learning. There's a phenomenon in the field of psychotherapy which does not seem to occur in some of the other fields that I have worked in. When I teach somebody how to do something and demonstrate that it works, they usually ask me where it won't work or what you do about something else. So when I demonstrate how you can work with people who are bothered by images from their past, you ask, when won't it work? Now, the interesting thing about that pattern of behavior is that if what I've demonstrated is something that you'd like to be able to do, you might as well spend your time learning it. There are lots and lots of things that we cannot do. If you can program yourself to look for things that will be useful for you and learn those, instead of trying to find out where what we are presenting to you falls apart, you'll find out where it falls apart, I guarantee you. If you use it congruently, you will find lots of places that it won't work. And when it doesn't work, I suggest you do something else. Now to answer your question. The limiting case is a person who has had very, very little real-world experience. We had a client who had been locked up for 12 years in his parents' house and had only left the house to see a psychiatrist 3 times a week, and had been on tranquilizers from age 12 to 22. He didn't have much personal history. However, he had 12 years of television experience, and that constituted enough of a resource that we were able to begin to generate what he needed. Let me reinterpret the question. If you ask a client, "How would you like to be?" and they congruently say, "I don't know what I want. I really don't. I don't know what resource I would have needed back then," what do? You can ask them to guess. Or you can say, "Well, if you knew, what would it be?" Well, if you don't know, lie to me. Make it up. Do you know anyone who knows how to do this? How would you feel if you did know? What would you look like? What would your voice sound like? As soon as you get a response, you can anchor it. You can literally construct personal resources. For most of the people who come to you, and for all of you sitting here, your personal history is a set of limitations on your experience and behavior in the present. Anchoring, and the construction of new possibilities using anchoring, can literally convert your personal history from a set of limitations to a set of resources. Another way to answer the question is that if a person hasn't had the direct experience they need as a resource, they have some representation of what it could be, even though it may be other people's behavior. That is, there is a representation within them which they label other people's behavior that they don't allow themselves to have. However, it is a representation that's in them. If you can access it fully, you can anchor it. You can do it directly or covertly. Well, I can't see the images that you are looking at right now, your representation of this friend of yours who knows how to do this, so would you pretend to be that friend to give me an idea of what we are working toward? Display that behavior for me so that I can get an idea about how Joe would act. Show me how you wouldn't act. Then anchor it as they do it. That's now a piece of behavior that is as real as any other behavior. Or you can make them do it. When people tell you, "Well, gee, I could never be like that," it's not necessarily true. We had a woman that came in and told us that it was impossible for her to say what she wanted and to assert herself. She couldn't get people's attention. And she was an assertiveness trainer, too, which is interesting. She couldn't go to a regular therapist because it would ruin her reputation. So we told her to wait a second, we were going to go discuss it, and we went out in the living room and read magazines for about 2.5 hours until she came flying angrily out of the office, "If you don't get back in here, blah blah blah." If you are flexible enough in your behavior, you can elicit what you want right there on the spot. We made the assumption, the presupposition, that this woman knew how to get somebody's attention if a proper context were supplied. We supplied the proper context, she made the move. We just anchored it, and then transferred it to other contexts where she wanted it. There's a huge advantage to doing it this way. We don't have to decide before we start working with somebody how many parts they have and what the parts do. I think the Michigan TA model is up to 9 specific parts: critical parent, natural child, adult, little professor, etc. At theoretical conventions they argue about how many parts a person should have. That's how the TA trainers and therapists instruct themselves about how to organize another person's experience. None of my clients have a parent, child, and adult, except the ones that come from a TA therapist. And then they actually have them. With anchoring, you don't have to decide before you begin the session what the legitimate categories of human experience or communication are going to be. You can simply accept whatever comes up without understanding the meaning of any of it. I don't know what X and Y were for Linda, but I know that I can operate at the process level, without ever knowing the content, and assist her in changing. You don't have to decide beforehand how many parts you are going to allow that person to have. You don't have to demand that your clients be flexible enough to reorganize their experience into your categories. You simply accept whatever is offered, anchor it, and utilize it. Woman. Do you always anchor the negative feeling? Because that's already in her repertoire. We don't always do anything. It's often useful to anchor the response a person doesn't want, and there are several ways to use it. You've all had the experience of beginning to work with a client on a particular problem, especially children, because children are so fluid in their consciousness, and suddenly you discover you are doing something else. The initial anchor that I established stabilized the thing we were going to work on, so we can always go back to it. If I had wanted to go back and find out where it came from in Linda's personal history, that anchor would have given me an excellent way to do it. In Gestalt therapy, if a client is troubled by a feeling, the therapist will say, intensify the feeling, stay with the feeling, exaggerate it. Go back through time, and what do you see now? The therapist is stabilizing one part of the person's experience, namely the kinesthetic component, the feelings that person has. And they are saying, keep those constant, and then let them lead you back in your own personal history to a full, all-system representation of what we are working on. By using an anchor, you can always get back to the same set of kinesthetic responses that you began with, and thereby easily stabilize what you are working on. That's one use.